In this episode of Your Double Podcast, Enrique, the founder of Find My Parent, and I speak to Glen Wood, a Canadian native and former equity sales manager at the Mitsubishi UFJ Morgan Stanley in Japan, who has been fighting for the past 5 years to gain justice for his paternity harassment case. Before we get to the episode, I would like to remind everyone that we recently launched a petition targeted at the Japanese government to stand up for the 3 million kids who have been trafficked since 1991 legally with the help of single custody laws in Japan. Japan does not recognize joint custody laws as the lawyers and judges profit from it and receive up to 30% of the child support payments until the child reaches 20 years of age. While it's a gain for the lawyers and judges, this is a loss-loss situation for the children and parents affected by the single custody law. Winning this campaign depends on our ability to call on thousands of supporters like yourself. Your signature is all that we need. Please support our petition and tell the governments around the world to pressure Japan to adopt a joint custody law. You can find the petition at www.change.org/jointcustodyjapan. Now, without further ado, let's get into the episode.
There's so much to me. I'm double since I got my superpowers from my family. There's so much to see. I'm double since I asked to be with both sides of my family. Ba-dum-ba-dum-bum. Ba-dum-ba-dum-bum. Ba-da-bum, 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 bum, 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 bum. You can be just like me. You're double. All you have to do is ask to see your family. You have so much to see. You're double. When you learn about both cultures of your family tree. Bum. Ba-dum-ba-dum-bum. We're double. Ba-dum-ba-dum-bum, ba-da-bum, 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 bum, bum, bum.
I'm just really curious about what you have to say, Glenn, because last time I was really intrigued, and I bought the book, The Enigma of Japanese Power. So I have it here with me. So I'm going to be reading this on the plane on my way to Japan. But yeah, I'm really intrigued by everything you said. It really resonates with me.
You're going to really enjoy that book, and it's pretty long, but even if you flip to certain chapters and read bits and pieces, I think you'll really enjoy it. The bits where he talks about the legal system in Japan, it's pretty much exactly as it is today. It's amazing because that book was written 30 years ago, right?
That's right. And I think one thing that really touched with me was, based on what I've known, was on the media side of aspects, how the entire media is controlled by the Japanese government. So I briefly just read a quick chapter. I was like, wow, okay, this ties in with everything that Scott McIntyre has said and what I've read and public forums like
exactly.
Reddit.
No, I think you'll find it very interesting, and again, insightful. He's very, very insightful, I find, in what he writes about Japan. And people take it negatively at times. I don't actually. Even after I read the book, I still like Japan. It's not. But I think any culture or any society, it's fair to critique that society, and he offers a critique which. He offered that 30 years ago, and it's still pretty much valid today. And that critique wasn't welcome in Japan. Many politicians spoke out against the writing. So it's, in any case, I hope you enjoy that, Enrique.
Will do. Thank you. SK, I'll let you take it away.
Glenn, first of all, thank you for taking the time to be on this podcast. With that said, while I was preparing for the interview, I had a completely different set of questions to start this interview with. But since you spoke about the book, I'm now curious to know more about the book. Can you give me and the listeners a brief introduction of the book you just spoke about, and why do you think it is a good introduction to how the systems are currently set up in Japan?
Right. So Carl von Wolferen is a professor, and he's studied Japan for a long time, and I believe he's Dutch origin, and I believe he's still alive and in Holland today, perhaps still teaching. But he came to Japan to do some teaching, and he ended up writing this book called The Enigma of Japanese Power. And as I mentioned to Enrique, the book was written about 30 years ago. Enrique, maybe if you have the book in front of you, you can give me the exact date. But it's 1989. So pretty much exactly 30 years ago. 1989 was the first time I came to Japan, actually. In any case, I met Carl when he was in Japan, and I really enjoyed his lecture, and I really enjoyed his insights. And so I bought the book, and for the longest time, I didn't read it, and then I started picking it up little by little as I had questions about Japan, and I find that there's many answers to problems that we face as Westerners, or maybe even foreigners in general, non-Japanese in general might face. There's many answers in the book in terms of how Japanese society is structured, how religion is used by the system in Japan, how the court system is used, how the media is intertwined in the culture and society, and the financial systems that they've built, how cross shareholding is used in Japan and how that is intertwined into the society. And it's extraordinarily insightful. So anybody who's interested in Japan, I would highly recommend the book.
I will definitely add the book in our show notes and also get a digital copy or an audiobook to check it out. Now, as someone who have just heard about the book and I've never even seen the cover of the book, I'm generally interested to see your opinion on what are the differences between the system in Japan and what you have seen back home in your home country or the western parts of the world.
Well, Enrique and I discussed this a little bit the other day, but Japanese logic and Western logic are really polar opposites. And so, I've discovered over the years in Japan, if you're facing a situation where you have to make a decision, whether it's in a company or in a team, often if I put my Western, kind of my Canadian hat on, and I do the logical analysis and I come to the conclusion, if I then flip that conclusion 180 degrees, that is very often the conclusion that Japanese logic will bring you to. And I often, as a very intellectually curious person myself, I often wondered, why that is, or why, you start to ask these questions. And this book answers a lot of those questions. So, Japan is a feudal-based society, whereas Canada and perhaps the United States are built on freedom, right? We one of the major tenets of our societies, we were originally people that were oppressed in other countries, and we came to North America so that we could have freedom. And so that in and of itself, it's coming from polar opposite directions. The basic cornerstones of our thinking, the basic cornerstones of who we are, as people, and our worldviews and our presuppositions about life and liberty and the very definition of freedom in Japan, I find is very different than the basic definition of freedom in many other countries in the world. Certainly capitalistic countries or democratic countries, the definition of freedom is very, very different than it is in Japan. And so all of these types of issues are kind of dealt with in the book. And it's the court system, for example. He explains very clearly about how the Japanese court system is organized around the political system and is organized around protecting corporate Japan and corporate Japan's interests. And that's kind of the purpose of the court. It has nothing to do with justice. And so from a Western perspective, when I think of the court system and I think of the legal system, kind of the first word that comes to my mind is justice. And so there again, we have kind of a polar opposite.
Glenn, I just had a light bulb moment when you mentioned the nature of courts and politics in Japan. If the courts are organized around the companies and creating wealth for Japan instead of the freedom and to give fairness and justice to the people, where do people go to get justice in Japan then? What do they do?
Well, I guess I'm still in the process of discovering the answer to that question, and it's kind of been a 30-year search, and I'm still searching. So I'm not sure I have the best answer for you, but I can tell you what many of my respected Japanese friends and scholars have told me. So when this first court when this court case of mine first came forward, and when I decided that I needed to stand up for the many people who I saw kind of being discriminated against and misogynistic practices within the company and whatnot. When I decided to stand up for that, it turned into which is still ongoing now, this court case. And in discussions with many of my respected Japanese friends, as I said, and scholars, people basically have said, and even housewives for that matter, have said, in Japan, if you really want justice, people usually do two things. They either turn to the Yakuza or they commit suicide. And again, a very different answer than a Western answer. But committing suicide in Japan has long been seen as a form of getting justice. And it's quite the irony is outstanding. But the idea is that you, by killing yourself, you end your pain, you transfer the pain to your enemies, and that pain is eternal. And in that way, you've achieved justice.
Yep, you remind me of the World War II stories that I've read in the past. Japan was famous for having the suicide pilots, or kamikaze pilots as they call it. They will dive their plane into enemy territories to destroy the enemies and also kill themselves in the process. Dying for your country in that way was viewed as an honorable action during the World War II by the Japanese army.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering if the culture of committing suicide to get justice is derived from the influence of the World War II Japanese kamikaze pilots.
No, I think it's very similar. That line of thinking, basically at the drop of a hat, the emperor, who, from a Western perspective, we see the emperor as just another man. From a Japanese perspective, they still believe in many instances that the emperor is God. And you can see in all the ceremonies, the recent ceremony where we had a new emperor. The emperor goes into a room which nobody else is able to enter and spends a night with Amaterasu, who is the sun goddess, who is the goddess of Japan. And during that night, the two of them together then mate and become bonded, and in that way, the emperor ascends to being a god. And that ceremony we just saw last year as we got a new emperor, and so you had this god telling a whole generation of young men to go and commit suicide on behalf of the emperor or god. And everybody, for the most part, pretty happily did that. They lost a whole generation of 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds because of this idea of kamikaze, which, as you know, the translation of kamikaze is the wind of the gods. So in the same way, if someone commits suicide, that is in the winds of the gods, and you thereby get justice for yourself, is one line of thinking. And the other line of thinking is you turn to the Yakuza, and the Yakuza is obviously the Japanese underworld, the mafia, whom you would pay a certain amount of money, and they would take care of the problem for you. And that still is alive and well today, and those are kind of what people told me is the way Japanese would attain justice, and it has nothing to do with the court system.
Right. Before we get deeper into these themes, I think it's important for us to go back to my actual questions so that people are listening will have a general idea on who are you and what happened between you and the Japanese courts and companies. With that said, correct me if I'm wrong. From what I've gathered from online sources, you were a celebrated employee of Mitsubishi, UFJ, Morgan Stanley, and you were unjustly fired for requesting time off or paternity leave to take care of your son. Is that what happened?
Well, I think you got some of the basics right. So, kind of in a nutshell, I was hired by Mitsubishi UFJ Morgan Stanley Securities, which is a joint venture between Mitsubishi and Morgan Stanley. And my job was to rebuild the global equities business for them, including Japanese equities, And I was hired in 2012. And for the first few years, I built an incredible business for them. We went basically from zero to tens of millions of dollars of business in a fairly short period of time. And my internal evaluations were stellar. All very positive, and things were looking really good. And as you mentioned, I found out my son was going to be born in 2014, and then that's when things started to change, because my son was going to be born overseas, and in order to go and get him, I needed to take some time off. And when I knew that, I started talking to the company about potentially taking some time off for family. And from the time I mentioned that, pretty much everything changed. The color of my boss's face changed. The frequency of our meetings changed. He wouldn't answer my phone calls, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, the fact is what I was trying to do was viewed from their perspective as committing treason against the company. I was asking as a man to take some time off, which was for the birth of a child, which again was viewed as, one, not my job. I'm married to the company, so why would you consider taking time off for family? And two, it was just viewed from their perspective as kind of the wrong thing to do. So that's where it began. That's where the story began, SK.
Now, being someone who is from Malaysia or the Asian part of the world, I know that most Asians are more sensitive than most Western people or people from the Western culture. I know that there's also a lot of Asians who have the opinion that people from the US or Canada, in your case, are very assertive and they don't understand the Asian values of being polite. With that said, the Asian listeners who are listening to this podcast might assume that you demanded too much or you were not being respectful when you requested your paternity leave. I just want to make sure that we can clarify that before we move forward. What's your opinion on that?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a fair question, SK, and I'm happy to talk about it. I've been in Japan, as I mentioned earlier, for about 30 years now, in and out, but for the most part, living in Japan. And I lived with Japanese people for a long time. My Japanese is fluent, reading, writing, speaking. And if anything, I usually get accused of being too Japanese in the way I do things. And I think that's part of the reason why, Mitsubishi Morgan Stanley hired me in the first place, is because they saw me as a Western person who actually was very Japanese and could adapt to their ways of doing business very easily. And so, obviously, when this came up, I was extraordinarily sensitive to it, and I was, in a management position myself. So, I was very, very sensitive to being very Japanese in the way I approached the whole thing. And I think it may help people to understand that, and I think you understand this, but so as the story continued, my son was born prematurely, and he was in the ICU, and the doctors were phoning me from overseas saying, your son, it looks like he's not going to make it, and as the father, you really need to come right now. And so when that happened, then I approached the company again and tried to explain the situation, showed them pictures of my son in the neonatal intensive care unit, and again asked for some time off. And yes, we had a backup system in place and all that type of stuff. So that was taken care of. And basically, my boss looked at me and said, medical systems these days are very good. You don't need to worry about your son. Just go back to work. And when I was told that, I was really shocked. As I was going to work that day, I was, when the hospital was calling, and I was I was going to talk to my boss, I was ready to go to the airport basically because, I felt I needed to be there, and legally I really needed to be there. If they were telling me, if your son dies, you're the father, you need to be here for legal reasons as well. And so it was a real conundrum, and I talked with bosses and with HR for several days before I just had to leave, and I didn't have any choice. And I think it was at the end of the day, I think it was, because of that they eventually fired me.
You mentioned something that I find super interesting. You said that when you asked your bosses for some time off, you knew how to go about it in the Japanese way. What do you mean by that? What is the Japanese way?
Well, all of these things, whenever you ask for anything that has to kind of do with yourself, you're always, kind of very apologetic. You're very gentle. You ask for time to speak to people one on one. You you approach things in kind of a very uh, direct but indirect way, right? So the Western approach would just be, if I was acting as a Westerner, for example, when the hospital phoned me and said my son was about to die, I would have gone directly to the airport. I wouldn't even have gone into the office. That would be the Western response. But again, I waited all night because they'd called me late at night. I waited all night, and I went into the office very early in the morning. I was very soft, very apologetic, and to be honest, by that time there were tears rolling down my cheek because I was worried that perhaps my son was already dead, and I was just although I had been in Japan a long time and I understand Japanese culture very well, I still to this day remain shocked at the response and the hardness and the coldness and the lack of empathy. And I believe that those types of responses actually are create organizations that are not sustainable. So when we talk about sustainability, and I think we can talk about that a little bit later in the call, but when we talk about sustainability, those types of actions create an organization which is non-sustainable.
Did you feel disrespected or betrayed by the company that you helped to build?
Well, absolutely, right? So by me in an family emergency situation, by me asking for some time off, I was immediately kind of rejected by the whole organization. And 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 that, looking back on it, that's a very Japanese response. It's kind of similar to the things we spoke about earlier, but still it's very, very difficult even to this day for me to comprehend that type of inhumanity and lack of respect for any rights of a person. um, is still quite stunning to me. And by way of background, the listeners may know this, but Japan has had a long decline in the birth rate, and they've got a demographic situation where more people are dying than are being born, so the population is shrinking, which they've long said they want to do something about, and they've tried to do things about. And so about 25 years ago, they actually changed the maternity leave and paternity leave laws in Japan. Um, Originally, when a woman, for example, would get married, she would be expected to quit her job immediately. And that was kind of the standard in Japan. And then the woman was just in charge of the household. That gradually changed over the years to women quitting when they got pregnant. And so, in kind of traditional Japanese organizations like mine, uh, the correct thing for a woman to do when she gets pregnant is to quit, which again exacerbates the economic problems in Japan with lack of workers and demographic issues. Um, and so this maternity and paternity leave law basically guarantees up to 12 months leave for both men and women, for both fathers and mothers, and that is granted to adopted parents as well. So it doesn't even have to be a blood child; it can be an adopted child as well. And the responsibility of the company is twofold. They cannot reject your application. So anybody can apply and the application cannot be rejected. They have to accept the application. And two, when the mother or father returns to work, they have to return them to the same job. And those are legal standards that were set many years ago. The reason being, as you can imagine, there was often retribution for people. So if women took maternity leave, when they came back, they would be demoted and eventually harassed and fired, is how kind of corporate Japan dealt with this new law. And for men, it was just expected that men would never take paternity leave, even though they have the legal right to do so. And if anyone did ever take it, well, they'd just be harassed and fired. That was the standard. And so when I submitted my application and it was rejected by the company outright, that in and of itself is illegal.
Right. Based on what you just mentioned, I have a two-part question for you. First of all, what happened to your son? Did he survive? As we never clarified that, and I'm sure the listeners are also thinking about the same thing. Next, I know that for any business or a corporate, it is not easy to fire anyone. You have to give proper reasons and do it the right way to make sure that you don't get sued. You mentioned that you arrest and then fired. So, can you explain a bit about how did they go about it?
Right. So to answer your first question, very, very gratefully, I arrived and my son was in the intensive care unit for a few weeks and then he recovered. And so thank God, we're very, very grateful that he did survive. And he's 5 years old today. No, I just meant he's 5 years old now. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, no, he's 5.5. And he's a very strong young man. So we're very, very grateful that he did recover. And to answer your second question, so when I returned to work, the first day back, it was just one shock after another, to be honest. But the first day back, and you should remember and remind the listeners that through the time I was off, I was still contacting clients. I was contacting the company. Even though you're not supposed to do that when you're on paternity leave or maternity leave, you're not supposed to contact your company. That's kind of the rule. Yeah, that's right. I was doing everything I could to maintain the business. So the first day back, basically I was called in and I was told that my job is no longer the same. All my management responsibilities have been taken away. And that basically I was demoted to be kind of like an assistant type of thing. And I was just flabbergasted because at this point you can imagine I'd read all the documents for paternity leave and maternity leave, and the facts are very clear. As I mentioned them a minute ago, the only two responsibilities of the company are you have to accept the application and you have to give people's jobs back. And so at this point now they'd basically not done either one. They did it very unabashedly and kind of in a very proud manner, almost as if they were proud for breaking the law. And I came to realize, as it says in the book that we mentioned at the beginning, that large corporations in Japan are above the law. They're not under the law, and they're very proud in that position that they hold that is above the law, and they leverage the law and use the court system and use politicians as they need to accomplish their overall goals as Japan Incorporated. And that's kind of the way the system is built. And so when I look back now and I look at how the company responded to me, it's much easier to understand in that context. But it's nonetheless inhumane, goes directly against what the companies say they are doing in their beautiful brochures and on their beautiful web pages. And obviously there's a global conflict here with Morgan Stanley being involved because their approach in the United States is obviously very different as well.
While researching about you and what happened to you, I read an article that mentioned that you tried to sue the company for wrongful termination and harassment, but the judge decided that you are trying to defame the company and reduce their credibility without any objective basis. Because of that, the judge decided to dismiss the case. Can you explain how did the judge arrive at that twisted decision?
Yeah. So again, in perspective, this is very typical corporate Japanese behavior. So if anybody in the company, if a young woman raises her hand and says she was sexually harassed by her boss, the first thing the company does is say that's a lie. So you're lying, and anybody who lies should be fired. So that's the first way they reconcile that and get rid of anybody who raises their hand. And the second thing is, in most companies, there's no whistleblower protection programs. There's no, there's no hotline. And if there is a hotline, a harassment hotline, as there was at Mitsubishi, that basically goes directly to HR, and it's a trap at the end of the day. So HR then turns around and phones your boss, and they use that against you to again harass you and fire you. So the system in general is never ever raise your hand about anything. And your job as a young woman, if your boss wants to sleep with you, then your boss has that right to do so, and you must obey. And if you raise your hand, you'll be called a liar. And if you try to sue the company, then the company will say you're defaming the company. And often the judge sides with the company in those cases. So that the judge basically protects corporate Japan and says, yes, you're lying, and yes, you're defaming the company. So you are fired. That's typically what happens.
I also read that you are trying to pursue the case in the Japanese Supreme Courts now. Can you explain a bit about what's happening with that?
Yeah, so currently we are in Tokyo High Court. So there's three main courts in Japan. There's the lower court, the upper court, and then the Supreme Court. And so currently we're in the upper court. And, the most recent development, which again was a shocker, but if you go back and read about the court system as Carl van Wolferen talks about it, it may not be so. Mitsubishi and Morgan Stanley have been using this so-called evidence against me, including emails and internal calendars and things like that, saying that what I'm saying is not true. Just look at these calendars and whatnot, these diaries and journals. And so far, again, the court hasn't even asked to see those documents. They've just accepted that they exist and that they're real and that they say what Mitsubishi says they say. Okay, so that's the first point you have to understand, that the judge completely trusts the Japanese corporation and doesn't trust the individual, especially if the individual is a foreigner, then there's no trust given to you at all. Whereas on the corporate side, there's 100% trust given. So even if they talk about a document and they don't submit it, it's viewed from the judge's perspective as the truth in most cases. And so the recent development in our case is our lawyers said, well, if Mitsubishi Morgan Stanley has all these documents they're talking about, then we'd like to see them, please. And we asked the judge to show us these supposed documents. And so Mitsubishi Morgan Stanley came back with this, I think it's 60-page document. And the first 50 pages or so talk about how internal emails have sensitive information, so we can't submit them to the court. The emails written at Mitsubishi are meant only for the person that they're sent to, and in no way they can be shown to the public, and that goes against corporate policy. So they spent, like I said, 50 pages talking about that, how it's very private and sensitive information. And then on the very last page of the document, they said, and by the way, we've now destroyed all that evidence, so it no longer exists. And, when I first heard that, I thought, oh, great, I guess we won. And from a Western perspective, again, you would assume that if someone destroyed evidence, they'd be immediately thrown out of court. As you can imagine, that's not the case in Japan. The judge basically didn't even blink an eye from what I could tell. And the case just keeps going.
I see. While researching about you, I also did a bit of research on Mitsubishi UFJ Morgan Stanley. In 2018, they had a big press release which was covered by most media sources, in which the newly appointed CEO, Saburo Araki, promised to eradicate staff harassment within the company. He also mentioned that he will investigate complaints and punish employees who mistreat others, and made a hotline available for employees who wish to file confidential complaints.
Yes.
Now, as a person, I believe that anyone, including big corporations, can make massive mistakes. However, if they take swift actions to correct those mistakes and take responsibility for the mistakes, in my opinion, they're still a good company. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any follow ups from Mr. Saburo or Mitsubishi Morgan Stanley since 2018 on this issue. So I'm just wondering if they really took any solid steps to address and eradicate the harassment claims, or it was just a lip service or PR stunt to divert the media attention.
Right. So my court case began back, or this whole situation, remember, began back in 2015, right? My son was born in 2015. And so this claim has been going on for a long time. The court case has been going on for a very long time. And many reporters have questioned Mitsubishi Morgan Stanley about what's going on. And so Araki came forward and talked to Bloomberg while my court case was still going on. And his response was in response to Bloomberg's questions about my case. So when he talks about eliminating harassment in the company, he admitted to Bloomberg that they have a massive harassment problem at Mitsubishi Morgan Stanley. And he said,
Right, I understand that. But if you read the press release and the interview he had with the media or Bloomberg, as he correctly pointed out, you will see that he promised that he will take severe steps to make sure harassments are a thing of a past when it comes to his company. That is back in 2018. Now it's 2021 and your case is still ongoing. So what gives?
well, exactly. So my understanding is that he said that to try and deflect attention away from the media attention that my case was getting. So, he tried to assure everybody that he was doing everything he could to eliminate harassment. But in my case, they didn't admit harassment. They haven't even submitted documents to the court. So, it seems very disingenuous to me. And if he really wants to eliminate harassment, then there should have been some follow-up reports after that pronouncement as well, right? So he said he was going to eliminate all the harassment in the company, that they had a massive harassment problem. All right, well, what did he do? It's been 3 years since he said that. So during the past 3 years, who are the perpetrators? How has he dealt with them? What situations have come up, and how has he improved the situation? How has he moved to eliminate the huge problem with harassment they have in the company? Certainly hasn't contacted me. We asked that Mr. Araki come to court and speak in court as one of the witnesses, because we wanted to ask him specifically these questions, and he denied to come.
Now, the article also mentioned that they were penalized a few million by some government body in Japan due to these harassment claims. Is that what happened? Or am I confused here?
I'm not sure exactly how the company's been punished, so I won't speak to that. But I know that they've had a lot of problems. I knew of, for example, a woman that had a tumor in her throat, and she came into her boss, who was the same boss as mine, basically, and said, the doctor says I need to have surgery. It looks like it's cancer, and I'm going to need to take, probably 3 weeks off to recover. And the boss's response was, sure, yeah, go ahead. And the day she came back to work, she was fired. So, these are the types of thinking, these are the types of policies that I think exist, and they're illegal. They're non-sustainable. So, to the extent that everybody's wearing their SDG badges and talking about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, I think I think this would be a good place to start to making the company more sustainable. And my hope is that they do that. My hope is through this process and through my efforts that the company is improved and Japan is improved.
Right. I brought up the press release to highlight the point about how most companies, corporates, or even the Japanese government use media to make sure they look good. But most of the things that are happening on the ground is rarely improving. They don't do anything about it. Even in the case of parental abduction and parent child alienation, most of the news are suppressed and censored by the government. And anybody who speaks out on it are practically censored by the government as well. I'm interested in knowing what is your opinion on this as you've been in Japan for more than 30 years.
Yes, so absolutely. For better or worse, and this is historical. Japan is extraordinarily resistant to change, and I think that resistance to change is actually really hurting Japan at this point. But um, there also is a stark contradiction in that resistance to change. So in that same resistance to change, you have uh, you have you have corporations like Toyota, whose famous approach was constant and never-ending improvement. Right, Kanai is the famous manufacturing approach from Toyota. Right. Yeah, and yet on the other hand, there's an extraordinary inertia and apathy and resistance to change, and children are taught from a very young age to just fall into line and not raise your hand and not speak up. It's again a stark contrast to Western approaches where we encourage students to raise their hands and stand up and speak. Um, and so that those ripples go all the way through society for generations, if not millennia. And so you get this extraordinary inertia. I think it was General MacArthur that said, if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less. And I think that quote is still very relevant today.
In the last 30 minutes or so, we have discussed a lot about Japan, but let's zoom out a bit. What are the long-term effect of this on Japan? What do you reckon will happen to the businesses, corporates, or even Japan as a country if they keep on resisting change?
I think globally we've kind of turned a page on our definition of capitalism, and perhaps we're getting back to what I think is the heart of capitalism, which is um, companies that generate outsized profits while adding extraordinary value to society. I think that's kind of the basic definition of capitalism, and that's not even stakeholder capitalism. That's I think that's just basic capitalism. If a company, for example, if a company is destroying the environment, or if a company is destroying society, even under a capitalistic umbrella, eventually that company will be starved of capital, right? The cost of capital will be extraordinarily high and they won't be able to do business any longer.
Yep,
So,
totally agree. If they keep destroying things around them to make profit, their resources to produce their goods will become more and more scarce.
exactly.
Even if you take simple supply and demand theory, we can see that if your resources get more and more scarce, you won't have the supply to meet your demand.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think part of the place that we went off the tracks a little bit with capitalism is that we started focusing too much on the short term. And so if you hire a new CEO and you task him with, raising EPS over the next 2 quarters, then his options are actually quite limited in terms of how he or she does that. So that CEO, she might step up and make decisions that are actually bordering on unethical in order to achieve that short term goal, instead of looking at the company more holistically and over the longer term. And to borrow a term that we now use a lot, sustainable, right? So, there's a lot of irony built into the word sustainable, right? When you start a company, sustainable means ongoing, right? So who would start a company that isn't ongoing? In other words, who would start a company or run a company with the view that this is non-sustainable, that this company is going to die, right? And so, in a sense, I always laugh. And there's always a snicker inside me when I hear people talk about sustainable companies nowadays, because you mean you're telling me this company was built to die? So if you bring the conversation back to the new CEO that comes in, historically they might come in and say, okay, we need to cut costs. Okay, well, fire all the pregnant women, and you know that might improve the bottom line for a quarter, maybe two. At the end of the day, you're going to have trouble hiring people. You're going to have lawsuits. You're going to have harassment issues. You're going to have corporate governance issues. And I would say even over a 3 to 5 year span, that company is going to be damaged by that decision. And so, likewise, when we think about Japan, and even if you go back to my situation, a micro discussion about, or the woman I mentioned who was fired for having cancer surgery, if you look at these types of situations, how is that impacting the company now and into the future? Well, I would argue that the quality of people they're able to hire is going down. I would argue that, especially now with ESG investing, and we get ESG standards, that ESG standards are not going to allow them to do that. And companies that do that, and it's in the newspaper, then their cost of capital is going to go up, which is going to make it more difficult for them to innovate and do business. So I think even Japan in this environment of the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, as well as ESG investing, I think Japan is going to have to adapt a little bit for this one. Although they'll do it kicking and screaming, and they'll do it very slowly, and they'll do it in their own fashion. I think you will see change, and in fact, we've already seen change. You might have seen recently the paternity leave law was changed to make it much more easier for men to take paternity leave, and give specific directions to corporations. And many journalists have credited that change in the law to my case and to my efforts. Whether that's true or not, well, we'll leave that one alone. But it's great to see those changes coming. And in fact, even at Mitsubishi, they made, after my case, of course, they made paternity leave mandatory for all men. So any man now at Mitsubishi, and I believe Morgan Stanley as well, who has a new baby, they must take paternity leave, at least for one day.
I'm not exactly sure if that's the right long-term solution to this, though.
Well, yeah. And again, it's quite a Japanese way of doing it, because what they'll do then is all men will take 2 or 3 days paternity leave, and then they'll submit their numbers to the trade ministry and say, we have 100% of our men taking paternity leave, and that will make the company look good. That's kind of what they're trying to do.
Right. Again, Japan being Japan, they're trying to do what looks good in the media and kind of ticks a box in the checklist kind of thing, compared to doing things that will make sustainable changes and make sure that things actually improve.
That's right. So they're not taking the pain; they're just doing window dressing, and they're very good at that. And again, they have control of the media. The media is pretty much completely controlled by the politicians and the large corporations. So they have a huge advantage there.
When it comes to Japan, people are older, say those who are 40 and above, might have gotten used to the system as it is. How about the younger people, especially those who are in college or just graduated? I'm asking this because if you observe it globally, those who are in their 20s and 30s are challenging many archaic laws and other wrongdoings by government and corporates. Do you think the same thing is happening in Japan as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's tricky to answer. I think you certainly have different views amongst young people than amongst older people. Typically in Japan, what happens, and young people historically have always had different views than the old people, the older generation. This isn't a new phenomenon that you have a younger generation that has different ideas. The whole idea in Japan is how fast you can stamp out those new ideas is kind of the goal of society. And if you stamp them all out and maybe one or two still exist, well, then they were worthwhile ideas, and all the rest weren't worthwhile. That's the view. That's the way of thinking. And so soon as a if a young person joins a large corporation, then for the most part, those views are stamped out and they have to fall into line. So the question is, are more young people not joining large corporations? And I do think that is the case. I do think there's a higher percentage of young people that have said or that have tried to join a Mitsubishi and then quit. So I do think you have attrition rates that are rising at the large corporations in Japan, which in terms of societal change and economical change in the country is concerned is a very positive thing. And I do think you have an increasing number of young people that are just trying a startup or working at a startup. Many of those startups are squashed by corporate Japan. So I'm kind of two minds of how much change that will actually promote in society. But I think the short answer to your question is I think there is marginal change. There's change at the margin, which I'm happy about. And I'm obviously very supportive to see that. And, I strongly believe that parental rights are real. This isn't something that we're just making up. And that, and if parental rights are honored, that it will help the demographic situation, that you will see more babies in Japan. So, I do think there's change at the margin versus the rest of the world. The rate of change, I would say, in Japan is still negative, unfortunately.
If I can reference back to how you said in the very beginning of this conversation that the Japanese government and the laws are tied to making profits, and the very essence of the way the laws are designed is to please the corporate Japan. How about the Japanese politicians? In your opinion, what they should be doing and what they should be paying attention to in order to make sure Japan becomes better as a country?
Right. So, at the risk of maybe sounding too negative, but again, putting this all in context, that I love Japan. So please keep that in mind. You have, you have an elite class in Japan, and the elite class are the politicians, and the elite class are the key corporate leaders. And it's not a large class of people. It's a small minority group of people that basically control the decisions and corporate Japan and Japan Incorporated. And at the end of the day, unfortunately, I don't see them showing the concern that I think they should be showing for the future generations. I don't see policies that are being put in place that are going to help their children and grandchildren, but rather help themselves. And so that is something which hurts my heart, and I'm deeply concerned about.
I think the things that you are mentioning, such as being able to take off a few weeks because you have cancer and need to undergo medical treatments, is not just employee rights, but just basic human rights.
Agreed.
Now, with that said, as someone who's challenging these paradigms in Japan and doing it very publicly as what you're doing, do you get a lot of resistance in the form of threats from the government or the corporates in Japan?
Yeah. So basically, I stood up and kind of called the bluff of the company. Right. I said, no, I'm not lying. And you don't have any proof that I'm lying. In fact, I couldn't be more honest in what I'm saying. And not only me, but other people. Right. This is the fact. And so when you do that against a large company or large group like Mitsubishi and Morgan Stanley, you put yourself, I think, in quite a dangerous situation in Japan. And so, yes, I'm very careful about talking about my family, for example. I want to protect people, and I'm very, very cognizant of threats and people that would rather me just be quiet. And so yeah, I think that's a concern, and it's certainly not democratic or capitalistic, and I think that should raise a lot of eyebrows. And we've seen a lot of situations even recently where there are some real ethical concerns about the way the system is being run. Just this week, we saw the Toshiba case, right, where We've got some very serious corporate governance issues, collusion with the government. So top management at Toshiba colluding with government officials to squash shareholders, and in particular foreign shareholders. So again, we see the same issues. It's There's no human rights, there's lack of capitalism, there's lack of democracy, and there's misogynistic behavior, as we saw in the Olympics comments that came up a couple of months ago. And these types of things, just don't have any place in a democratic capitalistic society, especially when we're talking about sustainability and ESG investing. And so, I believe Japan's in a state of evolution. You have to recall that it was just 60 years ago that Japanese farmers were selling their daughters into prostitution. And so, if you think about how Japan has advanced in the past 60 years, they've come a long ways, and I think they've done an incredible job. I just I just hope they can take the next step towards human rights and protecting parental rights, um, so that we can get over the demographic issues, and so that young Japanese people in particular can have children.
On top of the lack of importance given to parental rights in Japan, I also happen to think that Japan have some other critical issues when it comes to just human rights. I read a news article a few weeks back about how Japan do not recognize same-sex relationship. In that article, they mentioned a lady sued the Hokkaido local government due to the fact that her spousal benefit application was denied because she was in a same-sex relationship. Do you have any opinions on
Yeah.
this
So again,
matter?
there's a lot of window dressing, and certain towns have recognized the rights of LGBTQ and so on and so forth. But again, when you raise these types of human rights issues, including parental rights, including the abduction issues, including LGBTQ rights, including minority rights, including Ainu rights. When you raise those to the upper echelons in Japan, uh, for the most part, what I've seen over the past 30 years, they just get squashed. Yeah, so the price in Japan, because of the way society is built, this is very clever the way it's built, by the way. It's very clever, and I think to a certain extent it's on purpose. You've got a homogenous society which is basically monolingual. So there's very, very few people in Japan that speak fluent languages other than Japanese. And so basically, you've got 120 million people trapped on an island. And uh, and if you're taught from the time you're a kid, don't raise your hand, and then at some point you decide to raise your hand again, that's the wrong thing to do, and you are going to be squashed. You'll be fired from your job. You won't be able to get another job. Often the family job is what is used for children's school applications and things like that. So if your father gets fired, often you won't be able to get into a school, and so and the neighbors will often harass you if you get fired or you put up your hand. So you've got a society which is built on these precepts which prohibit people from raising their voice, from speaking out.
Another article that I remember reading was about how an engineer in Toyota committed suicide due to an harassment by his bosses and colleagues, and he was just overworked by the company. Do you know anything about that case?
Sure, yeah, and it was a very big case, and I think it's another example of something that was kind of buried. And the parents, I think, of the person who committed suicide followed up and followed up. And I do give credit to Toyota for coming forward now and apologizing and admitting that is what happened, that the person was harassed, and they apologized for that. I hope that they compensate that family an extraordinary amount for the pain and suffering they've gone through, and that they're going to go through going forward. But I do congratulate Toyota for coming forward and admitting that it was harassment and apologizing for that. I hope they follow through, as Araki has promised to do, and eliminate harassment as much as possible, so that we don't have these suicides of people being harassed going forward. But again, I think that's coming forward and admitting it and apologizing, taking responsibility, is the first step really to making advancements, rather than just these platitudes of, yeah, we're gonna get rid of all the harassment. I promise. You know, uh, come come forward, come forward and be honest, right? Yeah, we did the wrong thing when it came to Scott. We did the wrong thing when it came to Susan. We did the wrong thing when it came to Glenn. And this is how we're changing, and this is how we're going to improve as a corporation. Something like that in today's society would actually be extraordinarily beneficial for the company. You get a lot of free advertising. You become a leader in terms of sustainable business practices. And the opposite of denying the problem and fighting it in court, at the end of the day, is the cost of that. I think is going to go up astronomically going forward.
Right. And we have listeners who are from all over the world and they are coming in from different walks of life. I'm just wondering for those who are listening, what they can do, what people like myself, we are not in Japan, what can we do to help the situation when it comes to things that's happening in Japan, things that we already discussed throughout this episode?
Right. It's a great question, and I think there's a lot we can do actually today. So, and that's part of why I think Japan is going to run up against this wall where they find they have to make some changes. One of the major things that is different, as we all know today, than it was perhaps 20 years ago, is social media. So social media is very powerful, and Japan is still struggling with how to deal with social media. They haven't really got on board yet, but it is having an impact. And so many of my posts now, they get 100,000 views, and so there's 100. When I that used to be like kind of the readership of some of the large newspapers, right? There's newspapers that have less readership than 100,000, right? And and so I don't say that in any way to shine a light on me. I say that very humbly and very gratefully to say to Mitsubishi Morgan Stanley and to corporate Japan that the age of hiding dirty laundry is over. You're no longer able to hide the dirty laundry as you used to be able to hide it. We have we have multiple social media platforms. We have Glassdoor. We have ratings of companies, and this is only going to expand. This access to data is only going to expand dramatically going forward. So, to a company like Mitsubishi Morgan Stanley and to Japan Incorporated, I would say, embrace this data, use this data to enact ESG strategies, to enact SDG strategies within your company, and get on board with what sustainability really is. And that begins with taking responsibility, right? You need to take responsibility and admit when you make mistakes, and then move forward with an ESG strategy. And you will find, I think, that the change will come and you'll be extraordinarily successful. And that equally applies to the abduction issue, right? We've um, you can't deny parental rights to any parent, unless there's extraordinary circumstances of abuse or something. You can't. Um, it's the right of the children, and it's the right of the parents to be parents and to take on their familiar role.
Absolutely agree with what you're saying. Something interesting that I notice about you is the fact that you genuinely want Japan to improve and you're not carrying any kind of aggression, hate, or resentment towards Japan. I notice it in your answers where it seems that you still have innate love and admiration to Japan in some way. Am I right?
Well, I appreciate that, SK. Some of my best friends and my deepest relationships in life are with Japanese people. I have extraordinary admiration for families, for a lot of of very. It's very difficult to describe, but they're very spiritual, very enlightened, extraordinarily intelligent, very empathetic, loving people. That it's a culture that is developed over millennia, and you have my homestay family where I first lived in Japan. I still call them my mom and dad, and they call my son their grandchild, and that will exist forever. That's never going to change, and that's a relationship that I think I would struggle to have in many Western countries for many reasons. And so yeah, there's a myriad of things I love about Japan, but there's nothing comparable to the love and respect I have for the average Japanese person, and especially for those who have adopted me into their family.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Glenn, for all that. That was very insightful. Everything you talked about. That, I guess my question is for you, given that you give us such a huge background. I had discussions with Japanese um, regarding the parental rights currently, right? Which I think it's a fundamental human right. Why is it that they, in your opinion, based on what you know about their history and the way about their personalities, culturally, why is it that they can't all come to an agreement? Because when I talk to foreigners who are fighting for this in the political scheme, they say it's just a culture thing that Japanese just can't unite. Why? And on the other question, on the flip side of that, is like, why is it that they're not more proactive in public speaking about their own rights? In Korea and China, whenever they feel like their civil liberties are being violated or being quieted down, even in China, communist China, you see Chinese rising up. You see it going on in Hong Kong. You see it going on in Taiwan. But why is it that in Japan that it's just the government can just step all over their citizens and they just move along, not a word is said?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and the answer is not a simple one, Enrique. So, I'll apologize up front if I simplify anything or I make generalizations that I shouldn't make. But let me make a few observations. I alluded to this earlier, but one, Japan is largely, in terms of a culture, is quite homogenous, and they're very clever. Even though historically there was more heterogeneity in the culture, they're very clever to use the media to squash that concept of heterogeneity and emphasize that we are a homogenous culture, and that is one of the keys to understanding and to coming to the answer to your question. And so, with that homogeneity comes, again, monolingual. So if you compare Japan, as you just did, for example, to some of the other Asian countries, you'll find, for example, in China is very multicultural. There's many languages, there's many cultures in China, and those, to a certain extent, have been squashed and limited, and some cultures are being extraordinarily harassed. But in general, you still have a very multicultural society and a multilingual society, which is a very stark contrast to Japan. Indonesia as well, right? You've got several languages and several cultures that are fighting against each other and have internal disputes and so on and so forth. Those have largely been eliminated in Japan over generations. And when I first came to Japan, even people spoke about the Japanese race. Well, that was something that was promoted, I think, especially during the Second World War time. But as we all know, there is no such thing as a Japanese race. But that was something that was very strongly promoted as part of, I think, a nationalistic strategy. So that's one observation. Let me give you just a couple more, and then I'll be quiet. Japan has a very different view in terms of male and female roles in the culture. So we talked about this, I think, the other day, but you've got what I call a maximalist feminist society in Japan. And maximalist feminist basically means that the roles of the man and the woman in society are not viewed as unequal, but they're viewed as completely different. So the man and the woman might be equal, and in many cases, the woman might be more powerful than the man, but their roles are completely separate and divided, and they're not supposed to take on each other's roles. And if they do, then they become kind of an outcast in society. And so it's socially controlled to the point where, the man, when he joins a company, basically marries the company, and his first priority is to the company. And then the woman, when she gets married, quits her job, and her responsibility is to take care of everything to do with the household. So whether it's the household finances, or whether it's raising the children, or deciding on schools, or paying the bills, or cleaning the house, or cooking dinner, all of that is the wife's domain, including, as you probably know, controlling the finances. So historically, and still oftentimes in Japan, the husband's salary gets deposited directly into the wife's bank account, and the husband gets a stipend to live off of. And so this is historically what I call maximalist feminist nature to Japan, which again is part of this human rights issue, because obviously the children are the property of the mother under that regime. And so the court's decision then, under that cultural presupposition, becomes very clear. The court has to give the children to the woman because they're her property to start with. And so that's another key, I think, to answering your question. The third, and then I'll leave it. But the third key to understanding, I think, the answer to that question is looking at how, again, religion and how morals and ethics are taught in Japan. So the basic understanding that's taught to Japanese children is that the elite class in Japan, the people that control Japanese society, whether it's the politicians or whether it's the corporate leaders or keidanren, the elite in society, they, at their heart, they're taught that elite class are benevolent. In other words, everything that elite class does is for your benefit, and they wouldn't do anything to hurt you. And so you can imagine, if you're taught that from a time you're a child, and you believe that the elite class, the ruling class in Japan, are benevolent and they're doing everything they can to benefit you as an individual, well then, yeah, you don't need human rights. Human rights disappear. So those are kind of the three keys that I would throw out there to come into an answer, I think, to your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you for that. And I'm just thinking here, what would it take in modern Japan to have that culture shift?
Right. So that's where it becomes very tricky, because that cultural shift would have, I think, both positive and negative impacts on Japanese society. It's not something that would just be positive. And so many of the things that we love about Japan, are a result of these cultural traits, right? The trains don't come on time all by themselves, right? And it's the fact that nobody has guns in Japan. Well, that's not coincidence, right? That's by design. And those are, the reason you can walk on the streets relatively safely at any hour of the night, even in a large city of 30 million people, is, again, it's a result of these cultural traits that we both love and hate. But yeah, I think there is a realization, certainly an arising realization in Japan of, kind of what human rights are. And yeah, maybe I have some, kind of the realization that I think is slowly emerging in Japan, and I hope it accelerates. I think financially, for example, the whole concept of maximalist feminism, it's becoming financially impossible in many areas in Japan, and that's again, I think, why one of the reasons why the birth rate continues to fall, because the calculation is very simple, right? If you're a young married couple and you want to have a child, then basically the finances of that are you're going to cut your income in half and your costs are going to double because one of the parents is going to have to quit their job according to Japanese culture, and it's probably the wife. So you lose half of that income. And if you have a child, well, obviously your costs are going to double. And in many cases, that's an economic equation that doesn't work for families. So then you have people choosing to delay having children is kind of the result. And if that goes far enough, then people and society decides that they really want to have children, then that's a huge motivator to make changes, I think.
When I was married to my ex-spouse, who was Japanese, I'm American, born in California, San Francisco Bay Area. You go to school here, you go to university, try to get your degree, high GPA. You want to get a good position, starting job at a whatever company, organization you decide to work with, and then you hustle. You work really hard. You spend extra hours trying to show to your boss that you're worthy of getting a promotion, and you work your way up through the ranks. And if everything goes well, in your mid-30s, late 30s, you're in a management position, senior, VP, or something, whatever that sort, director level. I got married very young to my ex-spouse, who's Japanese, and she would say, I don't understand why you put so much effort into working. And I tried to explain to her the American way. And she explained to me the Japanese way, which I didn't quite understand until I moved to Japan. That in Japan, it's not about if you're the smartest or put the most effort in. It's about has to do with seniority, how long you've been in an organization. And when I was going through my divorce in Japan, I walk a lot, sit down at coffee shops, and looked at the society and people that I met there. And correct me if I'm wrong, you were in a management position in Japan. It had nothing to do with how smart you are or how much effort you put into working at that organization. It really had to do with how long you've been in that company. And another thing that I learned there was that salaries are basically identical across the board. And it all has to do depending on which age group you fall in, based on having conversations with individuals. So when I took a step back and analyzed that, I was like, well, it doesn't matter how hard you go, you're not going to get paid any differently. It doesn't matter which organization you go work with, pays pretty much across is the same around across different organizations and across different levels of jobs. They're give or take within X percentage points. So the delta was not that hard. So it also didn't. I felt perhaps that it didn't promote independence and also a legitimate work ethic of wanting to do it, but it was more like you're forced to do it. And in that, I find that very hard to sustain that level of effort for 20, 30, 40 years you're in the workforce. And I also think that also has an impact in terms of why people don't want to have families. Because like, okay, my 20s and my mid 20s or early 30s, no matter what I do, how hard I work, I'm going to make X amount of dollars. What's your take on that? Or did I analyze everything incorrectly during my sit downs and analyzing people?
No, I think. Thank you for that, Enrique, and I think you've hit another key to understanding Japanese culture and Japanese society and Japanese economics. So, and I'll come back to a comment I made earlier about Western logic leads you to one conclusion, and Japanese logic is often 180 degrees. And at the risk of sidetracking a little bit, you'll probably remember, because we're not that dissimilar in age, there were a lot of popular psychology books when we were teenagers that talked about the problem of codependence in the United States and in Western cultures, and how bad codependence was. Codependent. Even now, I think we've got buzzwords, right? Even I hear young people talking about codependent relationships and how bad, and in a very kind of negative light. Well, Japan is all about codependence, and the whole culture is built on codependence and interdependence. And that is in stark contrast to Western thinking. And you can see that flow all the way through society, whether it's families or corporations. When a baby's born in a Japanese family, well, typically, historically, the mother goes to her hometown, so she leaves her husband, who again is, I'll remind the listeners, the husband is the property of the company. So it doesn't matter if he's there for the childbirth, and he's not even expected to really take an active role in that. And so the wife will go home to her familial hometown and her family, and she'll have the baby. And basically, her mother will teach her how to take care of the newborn baby. And after 3 to 6 months, then she'll come home to her husband. Is historically the way it's done. And then even after she comes home, then she typically sleeps in a separate room with the baby, away from her husband. And the baby and the mother sleep together. And in some cases, that co-sleeping arrangement can be maintained until the child's in their teens. And again, that's completely different than Western ways of thinking and child rearing. I was put in a crib, and I was then put in my own bed as soon as I stopped rolling out of bed, and I never slept with my parents. And that has an impact, right? And the whole nature of the relationship is based on codependence. We're codependent on each other for life. We're interdependent on each other for life. And there's a really good book by Doi that's called The Anatomy of Interdependence, which discusses this whole concept of Japanese interdependence. But that's one point I would make after your comment. The second point is, you're absolutely right. There is no meritocracy. And again, that should be a warning sign. People see that and they think, oh, so there's no meritocracy. That means it's kind of no competition. That means it's warm and fuzzy type of environment. But the warning sign here is that if you have no meritocracy, then you don't have capitalism, because capitalism is built on meritocracy. So then if you don't have capitalism, what do you have? And I'll let the listeners decide for themselves what they think it is. But I would argue that it certainly isn't capitalism. And yes, salaries are basically standardized, so there is really no incentive to do better than anyone else. And in fact, someone who does stand up and do better than somebody else then is usually squashed and often harassed. And if they continue to do better than other people, then they're often fired. So that eliminates the whole notion of meritocracy within a Japanese corporation. And the last comment I would make is, all of this system is supported by an extraordinarily draconian tax structure. So the average salary man, if they do get paid more, they pay the majority of that away in taxes. And if it's not taxed while they're alive, then there's a death tax, which takes away the rest of the 70% that's left. So the whole system is designed around this culture of interdependence.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I appreciate that. And one thing I actually want to, if you can kind of explain to our listeners, is the pay structure in Japan, about the salary / bonus system, how it works. To me, it was the most mind-boggling thing when I heard about it. Thankfully, I never worked for a Japanese company. I never do. But basically, my understanding, it was like you get paid like $30,000, your base salary, and then you get a bonus of like, I think it's 50% of your salary or something in that, and it's divided into certain chunks of that throughout the year. and that's calculated as part of your salary as your package deal. However, the bonus is dependent on the manager every time it has to be issued out. If I understood this correctly, it was bizarre. So it was like there's a dependency of someone actually approving you to get your real salary or something of that sort. I was like,
Yes, that's correct. Your basic understanding is correct. Typically, the quote bonus isn't as we would think of a Western bonus, which is often or usually meritocratically based. It's just some percentage of your salary that's withheld, and it is usually paid twice a year, June and December. And it's pretty much standardized. But yes, the manager has the right to decline the bonus. And so it's interesting that you brought that up, because if you've read in my court case at all, that was one of the points of contention, is that when I came back from paternity leave, they no longer paid any bonuses to me. And the company's argument was that they said, well, we want to be compassionate to Glenn, and we want to give him more time to spend with his family, and that means that we can't pay him a bonus. But as you alluded to, it's basically withholding salary, and by canceling my bonus and demoting me, they were obviously punishing me for what they viewed erroneously and illegally as committing treason.
Yeah, when I first found that out, I was like, wow, this is mind-boggling. Basically, it's at the discretion of your boss to give you your salary or not, which is
exactly.
And then I guess another thing that you can kind of explain to our listeners is, and when I explain this to Americans, they look at me and their jaw hits the floor and they don't believe me, is the hiring process in order to actually be hired by a company in Japan, and the level of background check that they do about you as an individual and also about your family. I recall I was still married, my spouse then showed me this form that she had to fill out, which was, it would have been HR violations all across the board here in the United States, but it included information about me, about our daughter, about her families, her sister, literally everything. I was like, wow, like even to the extent, if I recall correctly, who the daycare provider was for our daughter. And I was like, I can't believe they're asking this level of detail for a job. But going back to what you were saying earlier, I felt like they were finding out everything about her because they own her after that. And it was scary.
Yeah, exactly. So, and again, we're generalizing here because there are a lot of new companies, I think, that are different. But in general, large corporate Japan, when you join the company, you're viewed as property of the company. Your first priority is always the company, and the company is in turn supposed to, quote, take care of you. And again, that taking care of you relationship requires that they know everything about you, including, your second cousin's girlfriend's name. So, it's quite extraordinary, and it's a level of, I think, information that many people in the world would be uncomfortable with.
Yep, 100% on that. And I think my takeaway of living in Japan, very briefly, I feel sorry for them. For the Japanese who live in Japan, many who do end up leaving Japan. I understand now why, when I spoke to them, they said they never wanted to go back. But even those who do live in Japan, looking back, I have a lot of sympathy for them. And the reason is because if you talk to them on one-on-one, they do have their own opinion, and they do not agree with their system. But however, they just don't stand up together as one and talk about it in public and bring awareness to it. I mean, if I were having a conversation with one-on-one on a friend and at a cafe, he would tell me all about what's wrong with the system, and then we invite another friend of mine over to for coffee, and then everything's perfect in Japan, nothing's wrong with it. And I'm like, what just happened? We were just talking about how it's everything's wrong. And vice versa, when I had coffee with the other person, they'd tell me like, yeah, everything is wrong, but in front of other people, no, everything's okay, everything's perfect. It's like, guys, you guys realize you guys have the same beliefs and you guys want to change your country for better, but for whatever reason, you guys just don't want to talk about it among yourselves. And it was stressful to me. I was like, because it feels like, for lack of a better word, they're just brainwashed, or at least on that facade, on the public image on how to behave.
Sure. So yeah, if I was to play the devil's advocate, I would say, it's arguable that all of us are brainwashed, right, to a certain extent. So it's, I think I want to agree with you because, in general, I believe that there is some quite dangerous teachings that can be classified, I think, as brainwashing. And I think, you could argue, for example, that the kamikaze movement that SK brought up earlier, that's arguably on the back of brainwashing, and it's very dangerous. On the other hand, there's a strong, I think the concept that you're talking about when you bring other Japanese into the conversation and then all of a sudden everything is fine. I think that's nationalism that's very strongly ingrained in people. It's the whole system of being Japanese. Karl von Wolfram refers to it as Japanism. In other words, looking at Japan overall as a religion. And I tend to ascribe to his thoughts on that. I think it is much more overall. The whole culture in general is much more like a religion than it is like a culture or simply a political movement.
Got it. Okay. That would explain a lot, I guess. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because religions don't have to be rational, right? You've got faith involved. You've got all sorts of, quote, brainwashing types of events that are involved in the religion that wouldn't be accepted in, for example, a democracy, or in capitalism, for that matter. So, if you view the whole system as a religion, then suddenly a lot of things make sense.
Wow, that's very true. I never thought about it that way.
And I think most people don't, and that's part of what I hope to convey in this conversation as well. That when people go to Japan for the first time or go to live or what have you, I think a lot of people just say, well, it's Japan's version of capitalism, and things are a little bit different. But at the end of the day, we're all human. And we'll work it out, is the general approach, I think, to a lot of people that go and visit Japan. But if you actually went to Japan and said, okay, I'm entering into a religion, and, a lot of these, when I enter in somebody's house, it's kind of like going to a church, then I think your perspective is very different. And then, for example, when you see these human rights abuses, or you see, people locked up without a lawyer for months and months on end because of some rumor, then it all makes sense, right? Because if it was a religion, then that would be understandable.
That makes 100% sense. Now, wow, I never thought about it this way, but you're absolutely right. It is a religion. How they approach everything in life there. It's cult-like. It really is.
That's right. And you have to subscribe to the religion in order to be a Japanese person. So that's another important point. You can't opt out of the religion. And
I think that's probably why I didn't fit in. I never subscribed to that religion. I just would not.
Right. And part of the religion is, I would argue, being monolingual. In other words, not being able to communicate fluently in other languages is one of the kind of precepts of the religion. And in that way, it's a very clever system in that way, because then you trap everybody on the island. And as I think you observed earlier, many Japanese who do go abroad at a young age and learn another language, they never fit into the religion after that. And they often find themselves, especially women, most Japanese women that I know that are fluent in English do not live in Japan.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. I think many Japanese women that I've met would say the exact same thing as you. Is like they don't want to live there, and even many Japanese people that I know is once they go out and they know another language, they don't want to go back, but they just don't have a choice because they don't have a visa to live abroad. And if they do, they'll do anything within their power to always live abroad, one way or another.
Yeah, because they don't, right? They don't fit into the religion anymore. And if you don't fit into a religion, it becomes a very uncomfortable place to be.
That's true. That is very, very true. And I think, yeah, that's an interesting perspective that I'm just currently just trying to process right now at the moment. It took me a while to get to that, to see this way, Glenn. Thank you for that. You're right, because I think about this, right? I'm thinking I met professors while I was in Japan, university professors and middle school professors and elementary school professors. And I remember one of the conversations I had with one of them was, how often do you guys teach English in school? I'm like, oh yeah, we do it once a week. I'm like, okay, once a week? You can't learn a language once a week. I'm like, well, is it all day class? Like, no, it's only 1 hour once a week. Well, I mean, you're not going to learn any language that way, 1 hour a week. And you're right. You have this island, and I guess now I get why a lot of Japanese have always told me island mentality. It's a small island with an island mentality. You close all its borders. You teach only Japanese, and you partake in this religion.
That's right. And if you're born into that, you really don't have much choice, because by the time you realize that this is a religion, it's too late. So you're already deep in the system. You're already deep in the organization. You already have passed the prime age of learning another language. You've passed the prime age of learning another culture and of traveling abroad. And the religion is keeping you so busy running on this wheel, the religion wheel, that you really can't jump off. If you jump off, it's almost committing suicide. And so that's why the system is so clever in assuring that it's homogenous and that people don't leave, and that you don't have the brain drain that you would have in other neighboring countries, right? So if everybody spoke English and they didn't like the system, then they would just leave, and they would leave from the smartest people first, right? And we haven't seen that in Japan for this very reason, that they do this kind of laissez-faire approach to learning English, and they tell everybody they're learning English, and actually they're not. It's, as you said, it's very superficial. It's window dressing, and I would argue at the end of the day, it's part of the overall strategy of the religion, is to make sure that people are monolingual.
Yeah, that makes 100% sense. What's scary is for those parents like myself who have children who are half Japanese. That's an eye-opener in terms of anybody who's thinking about going to Japan and having a half Japanese children.
Yes, I think it is. I think it's a decision that I think often is taken too lightly.
100%. I never thought about it this way. Had I known, I probably would have not been who I am today. Okay, I'm speechless now. SK, you can take it from here, Glenn.
Yep, I'm shocked by what I'm hearing as well. It really does make sense if you look at it as a religion. Now, with that said, Glenn, I will include your links and your change.org petition in the show notes as well, so that people can follow you and get the most recent updates on your case. Do you have any messages to our listeners on top of that?
Thank you very much, SK. Yes, I think any support we can get in terms of social media and the change.org petition, as well as following any posts on LinkedIn, Facebook, etc., Twitter, would be very, very much appreciated. I would say, during this very difficult time, a friend and I started a new business that I'd like to tell the listeners about. Please take a look at our homepage. It's called smartvisionlogistics.com. And it's, again, for me, it was a completely new area, but I'd done some consulting in the area of logistics. So I had some familiarity with it. And my long-term friend and now business partner, Nakazawa-san, and I started this business together a couple years ago. And you'll notice on the homepage that the business, the foundation of the business is sustainability. And my hope is that that my approach becomes kind of a two-pronged approach. One, on the one hand, I'm a parental rights activist. I'm a human rights activist. On the other hand, I'm actually showing kind of how sustainable business practices can be achieved while being a successful business in Japan. And so we founded the business in Japan. We've since started to expand globally, but our business is based on SDGs, on an ESG strategy. We have clear no harassment policies, whistleblower protection programs. All men and women take paternity and maternity leave, etc. I'd welcome people to take a look at the website and give us any support they can there as well, because I think as we hire Japanese men and women, and again, we're very cognizant of promoting women into management positions as well. That's another goal within the company, is to increase the number of women in leadership. I think we're hopeful that we can set an example, and that will draw some attention for different ways of doing business, for sustainable business practices. So that's one thing I would ask people to take a look at. Second, on the back of that, we have a book coming out probably at the end of this year that talks about not only my experience but others' experiences, and not only in Japan but around the world with kind of non-sustainable human rights issues or non-sustainable business practices in general. And in the book, I highlight ways of moving your business forward, and the cost of not adopting sustainable business practices is rising extraordinarily. So I highlight that in the book, and hopefully it will be kind of an incentive and a way for companies to take a look at their business practices and hopefully align them more with the United Nations SDGs and with ESG strategies. So those are a couple of things that I would ask.
Right. And thank you so much for spending 2 hours with us. I think Enrique have no more questions. I think he's still speechless. But with that said, I hope that your new business goes well. And I'm sorry all this happened, but at the same time, I'm very grateful that you took the time to explain the situation to us.
No, SK and Enrique, I'm very grateful to you guys. I think we're moving things in the right direction. We're providing options. We're showing ways that a great Japan can become even greater, and get out of some of these traps of human rights abuses. And I think at the end of the day, it will be beneficial. So I really appreciate what you guys are doing. I know, abduction issues are horrendous, and I've had friends that have gone through it, and you have my full support. And again, I think we're fighting the same battle here. So thank you for calling on me. Thank you for your time, and thank you to all the listeners for being so patient and listening. If people have questions, they should reach out to us. Reach out to me directly. I'm happy to engage people.
If you are interested in the materials, books, and links that we discuss, you are welcomed to check out the show notes. We have included everything there. Now, I would like to remind everyone that our goal here is to share knowledge with you guys and show that you're not alone in this. With that said, if you need specific legal advice, please get your own independent advice from a qualified legal practitioner. If you're a minor and if you happen to have difficulty in understanding certain parts within this episode, please approach a responsible adult or someone knowledgeable and ask them for clarification. We have done our best to make sure that it doesn't offend anyone. And if you have further questions or comments regarding Find My Parent or the interview, you can mail me at sk@findmyparent.org. If you're someone who got separated from your own parent and would like to find your parent again, please go to findmyparent.org and fill out your details. With the help of our smart algorithms and matching technology, we hope to help you find your alienated parent again. If you're part of an NGO or even a private company passionate about this topic, please reach out through the contact us page in findmyparent.org and we hope to work together with you. Alright, folks, that's it for this week. Speak to you next week. Take care till then.
So much to me, I'm double since I got my superpowers from my family. There is so much to see, I'm double since I asked to be with both sides of my family. Ba-dum-ba-dum-bum, ba-dum-ba-dum-bum, ba-da-bum, 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 bum, 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 bum. You can be just like me, you're double.